It is 12:01, so good afternoon. I almost said good morning. My name's Reverend Jenny Amstutz, and I'm honored to serve as the minister of Columbine UU Church. Welcome to everybody online and everybody who showed up here in person today. Today's presentation is brought to you by our caregiver support group, which Andrea Michaels, a new member of our church, has been really instrumental in creating and sustaining. We have a special guest here today who's actually a member of Columbine UU Church. Her name is Vanessa Johnston. I've known her about 20 years. She's been a Unitarian Universalist. We went to First Universalist Church together in the past. And she has been working for the last 6 years as a death doula. In April of 22, she and I co-led worship together where we talked about end of life. And Vanessa has done this presentation at our General Assembly, which is our Unitarian Universalist annual gathering to do our democratic work and our socializing. So it's a big gathering where Vanessa has presented. She is, quote, a speaker in great demand. We were going to say world-renowned, and then we decided great demand was better. So today there's coffee and tea and a few little snacks there, and please help yourself. Obviously, if you need to get up and go to the bathroom, this presentation will last about an hour. And afterwards, you are welcome to stay, again, for snacks and also for a Q&A session. So with that, I will hand over to you, Vanessa Johnston.
Thank you. Pull out my stool. I'm a little shorter than you, Jenny. Okay. Everybody hear me okay? Great, terrific. Thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate you coming for this presentation on new options in end-of-life care. I particularly want to thank the Caregiver Support Group and Andrea Michaels. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really important if you are walking the caregiver path to find others who are experiencing the same thing that you are so you can support each other. So I just want to thank that group for giving me this opportunity today. Okay. So, and also I want to make sure everybody got the handout that's in the front. Great, we'll be going over that at the end of the presentation. Oops. Okay, so I like to start with this quote: talking about sex won't make you pregnant, just as talking about death won't make you dead. Okay, a little humor, because talking about death, death is not contagious, so it's okay to talk about it. And that's what we're here to do. So thank you to the brave souls who came out today and those of you online who show your willingness to talk about this topic that still remains a taboo in a lot of ways, just like sex kind of is still a taboo, right? But it's okay to talk about it. Right? So we like to start there. And I will say the caveat that if you have recently lost someone, I know that that can be very sensitive. So I'm assuming that everybody here is in a place where they can take in this information. And I leave that up to you because it is a sensitive topic for a lot of people. And if you're in active grief right now, this may not land as well as it could at some other time. So we want to be aware of that. All right, so here's a little outline for today. First, I'll tell you a little bit about me. Then we'll talk about the death positive movement. We'll cover palliative care and hospice, the role of the end-of-life doula, empowerment and agency in dying spaces, rethinking funerals and burials, and then finally the ecological impact of final disposition options. And this is where I feel like those of you who are UUs in the audience would really benefit, because a lot of times we don't think about the ecological impact of final disposition options. So I just want to present you with all the information. So here's a bit more about me. My mission is to empower those who are dying to experience their final milestone with dignity and grace. I seek to provide individualized emotional, spiritual, and informational support for people with a life-limiting diagnosis and their loved ones. I wish to be a compassionate companion and provide a witness in sacred service to honor the final chapters in others' stories. And I am an ally and an advocate for all marginalized communities. So this is my mission, this is my passion, and this is what I approach every client that I serve with. So here's a bit more about my training, which I'll let you read that. I did do my training with Anelda in 2017, but before that I was a high school English teacher, so out in Castle Rock at Douglas County High School. So I'll tell you a little story that happens between the first two bullet points there. How did I go from a teacher to a death doula? So in 2015, I was looking for a new career and wasn't sure what that would be. And I was lucky enough to travel to Asia, and my family went to Shanghai, among many places. And I visited a temple for the goddess Kuan Yin, who is the goddess of mercy and compassion. And there were monks there that were asking people to write down prayers, and I wrote down one asking for a new career, because I was looking for a new way to serve in the world that would be compassionate and would use my unique skills in a way that people needed. And about 3 months later, when I came back, a friend of a friend said that they needed an assistant at the time. He was suffering from ALS and wanted a companion. And so I thought, sure, I told them I have no medical training at all, but if you just need a compassionate companion to be with you, then I can do that. And so I was with him for 2.5 years. And during that time, I heard about an end-of-life doula, who is someone that is a companion to those with a terminal diagnosis. And I thought, oh, that's what I've been doing. And so I kind of came to it backwards and took the training, and then, came back to my client and said, hey, I have these new skills now, and if you're willing, I'd like to work with you in this way. And they were open to it, and it was beautiful. And so after he died in October of 2017, I thought, well, gosh, I'd like to continue to do this. And so that's when I started my own business, and then continued on from there. All right, so here's the disclaimer for the day. Not everything presented today may be your choice, but knowing your options is valuable. So as a doula, I am a resource for people. I'm not trying to convince you to do one thing or the other. It's completely your choice, but I want you to be informed. I want you to know what all your choices are. And most people don't know that Colorado is a global leader in death care, actually. We have more choices than almost anybody in the world. And so my job is to let you know what all your options are, and then you choose. All right, so let's start with the death positive movement and that phrase. So death positive, it doesn't mean that you're trying to put a happy face on death, because death and dying is surrounded by grief and loss and often sorrow, and I can't change that. But what I can do is talk about it and bring it out of the shadows. And if we talk about things, then they sort of lose some of their power, right? But for so long, particularly in this country, we have not wanted to talk about death and dying. And unfortunately, Americans have a more complicated relationship than most other places in the world with death. And it comes from not talking about it. So the death positive movement, people who are death positive believe that it is not morbid or taboo to speak openly about death. They see honest conversations about death and dying as the cornerstone of a healthy society. So some of you may have heard of The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. Has anybody read that back in the day? Yeah. Or On Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Yeah, so that's kind of the origins of the death positive movement, and really just talking about these things. But the phrase came from a tweet in 2013 from Caitlin Doty. She is a mortician based in Los Angeles. She has a YouTube series called Ask a Mortician. That's very funny if you haven't seen it. And she has a website called The Order of the Good Death. But in 2013, she was wondering, why are there a zillion websites and references to being sex positive and nothing for being death positive? So this is kind of where the phrase for this movement that has, much longer roots came from. And so now it's really about anything that creates a safe space for talking about the one thing that will affect 100% of us. So here's Caitlin Doty in the middle there in cartoon form, and her YouTube series up on the top left and the website on the bottom left. So these are all different things that are parts of the death positive movement. On the right, we have an ad for Death Cafe. Has anybody been to a Death Cafe before? So I facilitate those. They were started in the United Kingdom in 2011. They're now all over the world. A lot of them are online. It is basically a safe space to talk about what it means to be a mortal human being. How do we process the information that we have a finite lifespan, right? And I always tell people it's the quickest way to restore your faith in humanity, because if you go to a death cafe, complete strangers, they will talk deeply and compassionately and thoughtfully about these topics. And it really is just a great feeling to go to one and hear other people's thoughts about something that most people don't ever talk about. So again, you can go to deathcafe.com, put in your zip code, find one near you. I used to host one in Littleton. A lot of them are online since the pandemic, which is kind of neat to go to one in another country, So, and there's always coffee and cake if you're in person. But maybe coffee and cake's not your thing. Maybe you like a brew pub better. There's Death Over Drafts, so that's over beer. You can go and talk about these important topics with people. And maybe you don't really want to hang with strangers. Maybe you just want to talk about these things with your friends. You can do Death Over Dinner and Dessert. That is a website and an organization where you can go and you can get a list of discussion questions and host a dinner for your friends and really have thoughtful, interesting conversations about death and dying with your closest friends. So that's Death Over Dinner and Dessert. So a lot of different organizations, but they all have the same purpose, and that's just to get us talking, and thinking about these things. So I'd like to move into where we are in this country as far as the medical establishment with death and dying. So Barbara Carnes is a retired hospice nurse whom I really respect, and she has these great booklets that you might have seen, especially the Gone From My Sight, the blue one hospice often hands out. You can go to her website and get them for like $4, and they're super helpful. But she points out that most medical care is about curing and treating a disease, whereas end-of-life care has a different goal in mind. She says dying isn't about the disease a person has, it's about the emotional, communal response to the person dying from the disease. It doesn't require medical intervention, it requires comfort care and communal guidance. So our medical system, our doctors, our nurses, I love them, and I'm so grateful that they do what they do, but they have a different goal than end-of-life care. They are trained to treat disease. But because we are human beings and we have a finite natural lifespan, there comes a point in time where treatments no longer work, right? Because everything in nature that lives dies. And so when it comes to that time, then you need to be more concerned with comfort and communal guidance. And so part of the problem is that we don't live so communally anymore, and so some of that gets lost. And a lot of doctors don't have training in end-of-life care unless they're palliative care or hospice doctors. So that's where we have kind of the disconnect here. So, how many of you are familiar with palliative and hospice care? Yeah, good. Okay. So in this country, and I'll just preface this by saying that this is for people who have been diagnosed with a life-limiting illness. So many people meet their deaths suddenly, unfortunately, or an accident, right? So all these things I'm going to be talking about are not options for those people. You know, I can't help people who die suddenly. So this is for people who have been diagnosed with a life-limiting illness. And in this country, what usually happens is you pursue treatments for that diagnosis. But at some point, you decide, well, that's no longer working, or your doctor tells you that the treatment is no longer effective. Okay, so that's a real gray area right there to begin with. But hopefully the doctor would recommend palliative care to begin with. And palliative care and hospice care do have the same goals. It's about improving your quality of life, okay? But there's a slight difference in kind of the timing of it and the things that you can do. So palliative care is focused on comfort care and treatment of the disease. So a lot of people don't know that you can start receiving palliative care as soon as you get a diagnosis, right? And you can still, if you've been diagnosed with cancer, you can still pursue those treatments and chemo as long as you want. But the emphasis is on living, right, and your quality of life. And this is really helpful for lengthy disease processes like ALS or cancer or any number of diseases that go for a really long time, okay? So the difference with hospice care, first of all, it's a service, so not a place. They can come to you in your home, in the hospital, in a facility, wherever you happen to be. It's free. It's paid by Medicare in this country since 1983. And the eligibility is determined every 6 months. So here's where we have a bit of a timeline, whereas in palliative care you don't have that. Hospice is determined for people who are within 6 months of dying. And the doctor will decide that. But again, we're dealing with death, which is a great mystery to us, and we don't always know, you know. This is very different from the other milestone that we all go through, birth. No one has been pregnant for 2.5 years, but death is different in that way. We don't really know, but doctors give their best guess, and if someone goes on hospice and they're still living 8 months later, that's okay. They don't kick you off or anything. They just reevaluate and see how things are going. But again, they're focused on comfort care and symptom management, just like palliative care. And you also get a team. For every person on hospice, they have a multidisciplinary team that is dedicated to their care, okay? So the problem is, as you may know, our hospices are understaffed and overworked usually, and they have quite large caseloads. So they may have 25 patients that they need to see and rotate through. So their time is really, really limited, okay? But still, this is support that's available for everyone. And I said 6 months, but the typical stay on hospice is 3 weeks. That's it. So people could get much more support than they're currently receiving. But it does take, admitting that that's where you are in your journey, which is a real problem for people because we do live in a death-phobic culture. All right, so what is an end-of-life doula? How do I fit into all of this? Well, first of all, I'm outside the medical care system, okay? So I'm not part of that team that I just told you about. When I first started this work, I thought, well, gosh, we should be part of that team. I'd fit right between the chaplain and the social worker. It'll be great. But the longer I've done this, the more I see that the independence and flexibility that I have as a doula allows me to meet families where they are and to provide support to them in the way that they need. So an end-of-life doula is based on the birth doula model. Has anybody heard of a birth doula before or used one? Good, excellent. So you know that a birth doula is someone who helps a person while they're having a baby, right? Everything non-medical, they kind of tend to. That's what I do, but on the other end of life. And let's look at that word, doula. It comes from ancient Greek, and it basically means caregiver. Now, if we're going to be completely honest, it was the slave in ancient Greek that did the caregiving. And so some people have a problem with using the word, and so they might prefer to be called a death midwife or a death companion. But that's where it comes from. And right now there are many training programs. You can go to nitaalliance.org and see all the different training programs. There's one in Boulder, Conscious Dying Institute. I trained with ANELDA, International End-of-Life Doula Association, but there are many. Right now there's no licensing or national certification for this profession, which I kind of feel two ways about. I want to acknowledge that people have served in this capacity for millennia. There's always been someone who helps people to have a better death. And I don't want to tell those people, oh, I know you've done this for 50 years, but because you don't have this piece of paper, you can no longer do it. So I don't want that gatekeeping to happen, but I also want to legitimize the profession and say that this is important. So if something were to come as far as certification, it would come from the End-of-Life Doula Advisory Council, which is part of the NHPCO, the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. So that's where it would come from. But it's still kind of early days. This has emerged as a new profession, even though people have been doing it for a very long time. So if anything changes in that area, that's where it would come from. And again, I can be called many things: death doula, death midwife, death companion. Somebody called me an exit coach once. That works too. Okay. So what is it exactly that I do? Well, here are the services that are offered. But again, there's a lot of independence and flexibility, so it's really whatever the family needs. And I will say that I feel like I can help everybody, but some people need me more than others, right? So if you have family that lives locally and is very supportive and around all the time, if you have also a therapist who you talk to all the time, if you have a robust church community and all those things, then maybe you don't need me, you know? Not everybody needs me, but some people really, really do, okay? So here's what I offer: companionship and advocacy. So first of all, it's companionship for the person who's dying, to be with them, to witness them, and to advocate for what they want, because the person who's dying is my number one concern. And sometimes that gets into tricky family dynamics, right? So my number one concern is the person with the diagnosis. I also do a lot of education and support, education like this, and support for the families I'm working with. Communication and planning. Often I serve as a liaison between hospice and the family, because those of you who have experienced grief before, you know that grief brain is a real thing. And it makes your thinking foggy, it makes it hard to make decisions, it makes it hard to remember things. But as a doula, I can come in as a neutral third party, not suffering from that grief brain, and remember the things that the medical team has said, and remind the family, and vice versa. So sometimes it helps to have that person there. I also offer respite and sitting vigil, so being with the person. A big part of my work is life review, and this is based on the research behind dignity therapy, which shows that people at the end of life are set up for a more peaceful transition if they have been able to look back over their life and talk about the things that have impacted them, that they're proud of, that have made a difference, the people that were important to them. If they have a way to look back over that life story and talk about it, it helps them. And for me, you know, it's always been about stories, being the English teacher that I was, but now I come in kind of at the very last chapter, right? And I ask people to share what has come before, and that helps people a lot. So that's life review. Vigil planning. Vigil is the last days or hours when someone moves into active dying, and typically they can no longer communicate their wishes to the loved ones around them. So what we do is we plan for that ahead of time, before the need is urgent, you know, and this is where my work really is in common with birth doulas. Is your bed by the window? Can you see the trees outside? Do you want classical music playing? Do you want lavender essential oil diffused through the air? Do you want a hand massage? Do you want somebody to brush your hair? Do you want pets on the bed? Who do you want around you? Is there somebody you absolutely don't want to come into the room, right? I can help with those things. But we plan for that ahead of time. And then legacy work. Legacy work is about helping those loved ones who are left behind process what has happened. And I'll just share two really quick examples of legacy work. One thing that I always share with families that is helpful is to keep a notebook by the bed of the person who's dying, just a spiral notebook, blank journal, whatever. And anybody that comes to visit, have them write down memories of that person, how they met them, a funny story, and just put it in the notebook. And then after the person dies, the family has that as a memento to remember. You might have seen teddy bears made out of clothing, that kind of thing. That's another example. My own father died in October of last year, and when his birthday came around in February, my mother and sister and my daughter all decided to make his favorite soup in honor of him. My family is in Georgia and Florida and Pennsylvania, so we were all over the place, but we all made gumbo, which is his favorite. He loved my mom's cooking, and we gave it out to friends. So that was a way that we remembered my dad in that way. And that's just another example of legacy work, to remember the person and the experience that you had as they were dying and to honor them. Aftercare, early grief and bereavement support. Typically, I stay with families about 4 to 6 weeks after a death. If they're still really struggling after that point, I will connect them with a grief counselor, somebody that's more trained in that area than I am. So that's typically how long I stay with someone. So ideally, it's from diagnosis until about 4 to 6 weeks after the death. And then the other thing you should know is that individual doulas may offer other services. So I'm trained in Reiki and energy work, so I offer that. I have colleagues who are home funeral guides. That's something that people do. Others who are celebrants that can do like a celebration of life ceremony. So it's really important to interview the doulas and find out what their other skills might be. And just to find a good fit for you. You know, I'm not a good fit for everybody, but luckily I know lots of other doulas that I can refer people to. Okay, so here is a graphic about all the things that I can do and all the roles that I serve. It might be hard to see, but it's, vigiler, celebrant, respite, all those kind of things. But again, I'm there to reinforce the medical care plan of hospice. So I don't create it, but I reinforce what's already been set. Doulas are privately paid. So again, outside the medical care system. So not paid for by insurance or Medicare or anything else like that, which is good and bad. It allows me the flexibility and independence, but sometimes people are hesitant to have, another bill to pay or another person coming in the house, right? So that's kind of good and bad in that regard. As I mentioned, currently no national board that regulates, and I think the most important thing here is the smaller caseloads for individualized care, because I only work with 1 to 3 families at a time and at different stages. And so that way I can really get to know what is peace for a person, what is comfort for a person, because that's different for everybody. Sometimes people have a strong Christian belief in the afterlife. Sometimes they're atheist, and it's my job to figure out where they are and what their beliefs are and reflect it back to them. So it's never about what I believe. It's always about what is the belief of the person who's dying and how can I offer comfort to them. So here are some of the benefits of end-of-life doula care that people report. I typically always ask people who contact me, are you on palliative care and hospice? That's my first question. And if they're not, why not? Some people have had really bad experiences with hospice, so I'm a little bit of an easier in towards helping them at the end of life, and that's fine. But it does look different if you don't have that support in place. But yes, people report more support and better continuity of care if they engage with an end-of-life doula. Okay, so I love this quote, "Death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it." And we can see these leaves here demonstrating that. Okay, how are we doing so far? It's a lot. Everybody want to take a deep breath and let it out? Good, thank you. Okay. All right, so next we're going to talk about empowerment and agency. So most of you know what empowerment and agency is, but maybe you've never applied it to end-of-life decisions. But you can, right? And this is really important because end-of-life choices, if you create your own living will, you are exercising your agency, right? The thing about a life-limiting diagnosis is a lot of times your agency is taken away from you, right? And that makes it really difficult for people. They can no longer move their bodies in the way they want, you know, that sort of thing. They can no longer make the decisions that they wish they could make. But there are some decisions you can still make. So as a doula, I always try and return decisions to people as they can make them, you know? Now, if there's a dementia diagnosis in place, that gets very tricky. That's its own special kind of challenge there, and we can talk more about that. But assuming that the progression we're talking about is a physical disease, you can do things like create a living will, write an advance directive. There's been great research coming out about psychedelic-assisted therapy for extreme thanatophobia, which means fear of death. Because there are some people who get very, very close to the end and are in existential dread about it. And that's a horrible place to be. So the research coming out of Johns Hopkins and other places is that one session with psilocybin mushrooms can help alleviate that fear. And that's what we would want for people because it's suffering. Another process that you could choose is voluntary stopping eating and drinking, which is referred to as VSED. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Also, medical aid in dying, MAID, and home funerals. So it is legal to have a home funeral in your house, okay? So those are just some different choices you can make. So let's talk about MAID. This is medical aid in dying. You might have also heard on the East Coast, there's an organization called Death with Dignity, also in Oregon and Washington. And here, Compassion and Choices was instrumental in getting the law passed. So it's important to pay attention to language. So we don't want to say it's physician-assisted suicide because it's not suicide. This option is available only to people who are dying anyway, okay? So people who are healthy are not eligible for this. So you have to be within 6 months of dying, and you have to go through a pretty lengthy process, which most people don't know, but it can take a while. And unfortunately, I've had clients who wanted to do this, but were unable to because their disease progressed so much that they died before they had approval. So there is a process in place. In this state, it's different in every state that has it. It's legal in 10 states plus DC as of last year, but it's a little different in every state. Here in Colorado, you have to meet with 2 different physicians 2 different times, and they have to establish your mental capacity and the length of your disease process. And so that takes time, right, to make that appointment, to meet the doctor, all those kind of things. Meanwhile, people are declining rapidly. And the medication, you have to be able to self-administer, right? That's the key part, is you have to be able to self-administer, and which is fine for all of us here in the room that are healthy. But if you have a disease that has weakened you tremendously and you're not able to drink 2 ounces of a liquid in 2 minutes, then you're not going to be able to do this, right? So it's not as easy as some people think. And also, I'll just say, while it's legal in this state, there are many physicians who won't prescribe the medication, and there are many hospices who are technically neutral. So what that looks like in the real world is they'll say, well, you can do that, but we're not going to help, and we can't be in the room. So this is where a doula might be really helpful. So there are some nuances there that most people aren't aware of. Okay. So the next one is voluntary stopping eating and drinking. This is legal in all 50 states. There was a Supreme Court decision in Missouri in 1991 that established that everyone has the right to refuse medical care, which includes nutrition and hydration. So this is your right. A lot of people do this informally, right? But we do have a name for the process. And it is a natural process of death, just a bit sped up, because what we're trying to do is avoid the suffering. Just like MAID before this one, it's a trajectory of this illness, and you know what's ahead. And so we're trying to alleviate that suffering. It does require a knowledgeable support team. And I always, for MAID and VSED, work in a team, not just me. And so, this can take anywhere from 3 to 15 days, depending, but it's another choice that people do have. Okay, so now, rethinking funerals and burials. As we go into the last part of the presentation, I want you to be thinking about, why do we live in a death-phobic culture anyway? It wasn't always as much as it is now, because 200 years ago, people saw death much more often, right? Now we've kind of outsourced it, and I understand why, because there's a lot of grief and loss, but sending people to die in hospitals did us a disservice, because we don't see it, and we don't know what's normal, and we don't know what's natural. But be thinking about that, and then also, what impact does this have on grief? Those of you who have been through this know, and grief is I could do a whole other presentation on that, but be thinking about these questions. All right, so let's talk about home funerals. They are safe and legal in all 50 states. Here's a picture from 200 years ago. This is, all funerals used to be home funerals, okay? And so we would have the body laid out in the front parlor, right? And you had to have doors big enough for the casket and that kind of thing. Funeral homes, the reason they're called homes is because they're based on this idea. And, that industry didn't come about until about the 1860s, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But home funerals are family and community-centered care. They're a lot cheaper, and you can have a home funeral guide. So the bottom picture here is my colleague Cindy Kaufman, who is a home funeral guide, and it definitely changes our experience with grief. So if you're interested, you can go to the homefuneralalliance.org and find out more about that. I'll put in a word here for ritual and ceremony. Super important, very effective, even if you don't believe in them. Okay? So I would say, even if it's something very, very simple, like lighting a candle and speaking someone's name. It can be that simple. But it really helps our heads and our hearts catch up to each other about what has happened. And it helps us connect to our sense of self and what's meaningful in our lives. So I know a lot of people say, oh, I don't want to be a burden, I don't want to have any kind of funeral or whatever. I always encourage people to do something, to plan something. Ask your loved ones to do something to remember you, because it's really for the people who are left behind and to help them process the loss, right? So it's not being a burden on someone, it's giving them a gift to say, this is how I want to be remembered, okay? All right, so now we'll move into final disposition options. What do you do with the body? All right, so here are 5 options here that we have in Colorado. We have a few more, and this is, you'll find this information on the handout as well. So on the far left is traditional burial, and then next to it we have green burial, so 2 types of burial. Then next to that we have 2 types of cremation, fire cremation on the top, water cremation on the bottom. And then finally is the newest one, natural organic reduction or composting. Okay, so those are kind of some images to keep in mind. All right, so traditional burial, and again, not trying to convince you of one thing or another, but you should have all the information. So here's the information. The body is embalmed and placed in a steel or wooden casket underground with a concrete vault. So concrete underground, casket underground, body is embalmed. So this is familiar, of course, and accepted by most faith traditions. 37% of Americans choose this option, but you should know it's very costly to the environment. So if this is the option that feels right to you and your family and your culture and your religion, by all means, choose this. At the same time, you should know that 800,000 gallons of formaldehyde-based embalming fluid are placed in the ground each year, and that Americans bury 73,000 kilometers of hardwood and 1.5 million tons of concrete every year in cemeteries. That's a lot, into the ground, and it can be very expensive. And especially if you do like a whole service with catering and all that stuff, I mean, it can be really close to almost $30,000, right, just depending. So it doesn't have to be that expensive, but it can be. Oops. All right, so the other type of burial is green burial, and green burial basically means no embalming. And so what I'll say about this is embalming is not required by law. You do not have to embalm. Embalming came to this country in the 1860s. Now, originally it was in ancient Egypt, right, with the pharaohs and things. We're the only country that embalms, just so you know. And the reason why is because after the Civil War in the 1860s, people in the North wanted their soldiers to come back home for burial. And to do that, they had to ship the bodies in caskets on a train. And so that's when they started to embalm bodies so that they could make that 3-day journey. And during that time, that's when the funeral industry happened. Okay? So this is how it happened in this country, and we are unique in this. So green burial is now an option. You do not have to be embalmed. The body is placed in a cotton or silk burial shroud or a natural biodegradable container, straw, unfinished wood, cardboard, or wicker like this one. And depending on where you go, they have different kind of rules around it, but there's never going to be a concrete vault or metal casket. The depth may change, maintenance kind of things may change. It really depends on where you go. Has anybody been to Seven Stones out in Roxborough? It's a beautiful green burial cemetery. Yeah, they call themselves a Botanic Gardens Cemetery. Yeah, but you can find them all over the country. Okay. Yeah, and so it's focused on family-centered care and participation, children encouraged to take part, and Green Burial Council is fantastic. You can go there. There's another really great one in Evergreen as well. Okay, so those were our 2 burial options. Now let's move into cremation. So the first is traditional fire cremation. It's cheaper than burial, that's good. Simpler process. You get ashes to store or spread, and just so you all know, it's not really ashes like a fire ashes, but it's cremains. It's cremated remains of the person, so like bone fragments, right? But 56% of Americans choose this option, and it's been going up since the 80s. So this is a much more popular option now, but you should know it's very costly to the environment. Just to operate a crematorium uses a lot of fossil fuels. So it produces 535 pounds of CO2 per cremation. So like taking a 609-mile car journey in a car. That's 360,000 metric tons of CO2 yearly. And it releases all those toxic chemicals into the air. So traditional burial, it's in the ground. Traditional cremation, it's in the air, okay? And also those cremated remains are toxic because they're bone fragments. So if you're putting them into rivers or streams or oceans, not great for the animals living in there, you know? So again, I present this as giving you all the information about this option. Oops. And then we have water cremation. So water cremation is also called aquamation, biomation, resomation, flameless cremation, or alkaline hydrolysis is the technical name. It has a low environmental impact, and it uses 90% less cremation than traditional flame cremation, but you still get the cremains, so you have a tangible object to memorialize your person. And it also produces a non-toxic bionutrient liquid for fertilizer. So this is from Beatrix Cremation in Denver, And what you get back, if you choose, you don't have to get any of this, but if you choose, you can have the cremains and also the liquid. Typically, though, the provider will use this liquid and, like Be a Tree partners with Half Moon Farms in Lakewood and waters their trees and flowers and things with that. So that is water cremation. Here's another graphic for it, for water cremation. It uses 1/10 of the carbon footprint of fire cremation, and it's a method that uses lye, alkaline lye, and heat to dispose of the body. So this was taken from farmers in the 19th century. This is how they dealt with their cattle. So that's the process that's used and has been implemented. And using this method, the body is placed in a vessel with a tremendous amount of pressure, and then it's heated to 300 to 320 degrees Fahrenheit, and the entire process takes about 4 to 6 hours to break down. And then in the end, you have the sterile effluent, so that's the liquid. It's basically water, salt, sugars, amino acids, and peptides, so pH neutral, no DNA, and then the bone fragments, that's the cremains. So that's what you have at the end of this process. And then here's one more. As I mentioned, invented in the late 19th century for use on livestock. It's currently legal in 28 states. The only problem is, of those 28, only 19 of them have providers, right? So you can see, it should be becoming obvious that Colorado has a lot more than most places as far as options, okay? But that could be changing because more people are interested in it. But this is kind of how it works. Okay, and then finally we have natural organic reduction, which is the newest and was just legalized here 2 years ago. It's currently only offered by 4 companies in the United States. So 2 are in Washington, 1 is in Oregon, and 1 is in Colorado. So Oregon has an asterisk because they only work with people in their state, but the other 3 work with anybody. So you can contact any of them. And these are the vessels that they use. And the one where you can see inside, you can see all the kind of natural material there. So natural organic reduction is also called human composting, body composting, recomposition, or terramation. It's legal in 6 states and Sweden, and it gently transforms human remains into soil in 4 to 12 weeks. So that's a pretty long range, right? But it really depends on the method that the provider is using and how often they turn the vessels. So those of you that are familiar with composting, you know how that works. You turn the soil, and so it's the same idea. And the process uses large vessels to hold human remains, which are combined with straw, wood chips, alfalfa, and other natural materials. And at the end of this 12 weeks, there's about 200 pounds of soil. So that's a lot. It's either will fill up a full truck bed or 4 wheelbarrows, just to give you an idea. It's a lot. And so this soil can be used on trees and plants and donated to conservation efforts. This picture up at the top was from March of last year. Those are staff from the Natural Funeral. We were out at Colorado Burial Preserve in Florence, Colorado. So the first person in Colorado to do natural composting died at the fall equinox of 2021, and they chose this method. And so the spring equinox of 2022, we had a beautiful ceremony at the Colorado Burial Preserve, and all of this really rich soil was the result. And there was a ritual where we made a mandala with all the soil, and Colorado Burial Preserve is dedicated to preservation of natural native grasses and plants and trees and shrubs and flowers and all that. So this is where this soil has ended. So for those of you that have fought for environmental justice all your life, I would encourage you to consider this option just because it does give back to the land, where some of the other choices are not as beneficial. So here's a bit more. This is Recompose out in Washington. I like this information here at the bottom. Natural organic reduction uses 1/8 the energy of cremation and saves over a metric ton of CO2 per person. That's the equivalent of the energy required to power 49,000 homes for a year, or the equivalent of 10 million seedlings growing into trees for 10 years. So it makes a difference, you know, when we think that every single person on this planet will die at some point or the other, and then something has to be done with their body, right? So this is an option to consider. So here's a summary, emissions per body versus disposition type. So we start with conventional burial on the far left there. And then flame cremation is next, so it's actually a little worse for the environment. Then water cremation. The next one is green burial, so now we're giving back to the earth. The second to last one there is if you were eaten by wolves. So that one's a little different if you maybe had a hiking accident gone awry, I don't know. And the body was just left, that's kind of how it would affect the earth. And then finally, natural organic reduction on the end. All right, so more momentum is growing with new legislation. So 6 new states are thinking about it. And I think right now it's still pretty expensive, but I think the cost will come down as we have more providers and there's more demand, right? That's kind of how that goes. So finally, choices and options. Human mortality rate still 100%. I think it will always be 100%. So that means that we have to plan accordingly. So make your advanced care directives, do your estate planning, make your funeral wishes known or pre-plan. Every one of these providers have pre-planners on staff. So you can do this as soon as you'd like, but most people wait too late. And they don't ever even talk to anyone about what they want. So what I'd like you to do is to share at least one thing you've learned from this presentation with at least one person. That's all. Because we have to get the conversation going, right? And that's part of being a death positive, which I'm going to assume all of you are now, is you are willing to talk about these difficult things with people. If you need help with with advanced care planning, you can go to 5wishes.org. Maybe some of you already have. It's a great website to help you with that. If you want to talk about this with people, but you just don't know how, go to the Conversation Project. They have templates for conversations and how to even begin talking about these things. It's really, really helpful. And then finally, this is my nonprofit group, the Colorado End of Life Collaborative. So we're a 501c6 group, and we're all across the state. We currently have 16 end-of-life members, our end-of-life doula members across the state, so you can go and find our directory there. Most are in Metro Denver area. And then we also have affiliates who are celebrants, grief counselors, estate planners, funeral providers. So the Natural Funeral, Beatree Cremation, Feldman Mortuary, which I'll say those in the Jewish faith have always done green burial. They've never embalmed, right? So Feldman Mortuary offers that, and they're one of our affiliate members as well. So you can go to our website, the Colorado End of Life Collaborative, and find out more about that. And then here's my email. If anybody wants to email me, I have 2 different ones. One is my business and one is my nonprofit. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, so if you want to find me there, this is for my doula kit, what I take to visit clients. And then finally, I like to end with this quote, "Sunsets are proof that endings can often be beautiful too." So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, so I think we have 30 minutes for questions, right? So how do we want to do it? You just want me to call on people?
Is that mic on deaf?
Yeah, that's over.
Okay. So I can pass the mic if anybody.
Okay. I think Susan had a question.
We're tangled. But well, it's good if I can. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is
Yeah, please.
that I have worked with the University of Colorado
Mm-hmm.
to